Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Andreatta. And just to introduce you, Dr. Andreatta is a massively influential thought leader within the learning industry. In fact, Growth Engineering recently named her as one of the top 20 L&D thought leaders in our annual rankings. She has recently released a new book about the brain science of learning. It's called Wired to Grow, and it's about leveraging our natural neurological wiring to help unlock the fullest expression of who we are, to become or develop into something more. And what makes Britts stand out is that everything she says and writes is grounded in rigorous, cutting-edge research. In fact, she served as professor and dean at the University of California, Antioch University, and several graduate schools. She then moved on to become Chief Learning Officer for Lynda.com and Senior Learning Consultant for Global Leadership and Talent Development at LinkedIn. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us, Britt. Thank you so much for joining us. And just perhaps as our first question, it is very clear that you've got an impressive background that draws on a range of different fields. It'd be great if you could tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my PhD is in education, leadership, and organization. So I've always kind of looked at that intersection between leadership development and the learning experience. But when I was a graduate student, neuroscience wasn't really a thing yet. So I turned to that in recent years just because I was fascinated with it and I wanted to learn more for my own craft. So I've kind of become a quasi-expert in neuroscience. I'm very comfortable reading academic journals and I can tell good science from bad science. But more importantly, you know, academicians and scholars are oftentimes very siloed in their fields. And so I like to read very widely across many disciplines. And that's where I find a lot of these great intersections and connection points that as particularly as a learning practitioner who designs and develops learning experiences for others, I can see how they can be applied. Before that, I had a master's in communication and media, and I've always been in some form educating, creating learning experiences for others. So it's been a really nice combination of kind of the why behind everything, but then the hands-on doing of it.
Thank you so much. And so it kind of makes sense given your background, but you use the term science-based learning a lot. And this is something that's become quite popular in the learning industry recently. It'd be great to know a bit more about what you mean by this and why you think it's important.
So science-based learning just really means that you're using practices for learning that are backed up with science. So there's been a study that has the right amount, the right amount of participants to be valid, that the instrumentation is reliable, that the results are replicable. So good science really is, it's been tested. It's not just someone's great idea that they think is awesome, and trust me, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you have a great idea, but then ultimately you can't prove that it's true, we shouldn't be rolling it out to thousands of people in our organizations. So I like to really go with science-based, evidence-backed practices and data, and then turn those into actionable items so that we can know how to roll it out or what to do with that information. But I think it's really important that we lean on the very rigorous practices that the scientific community already has.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And this is something I think that really shines through in your book, Wired to Grow. And I just want to read a quick quote from the introduction to it, and it goes like this: neuroscience has come far in the past 5 years. Many more researchers are looking at learning, memory, and behavior change. New tools and big data are shifting what scientists know about the brain, and memory research has undergone radical transformation due to some groundbreaking studies. And what really seems so interesting to us at Growth Engineering is that Wired to Grow is based almost entirely on research which has happened since 2014. So that's within the past 5 or 6 years. And of course, that's really not a very long time in the grand scheme of things. And so we'd love to know more about how much, speaking collectively, our understanding of the brain has changed since then.
Well, I'll tell you a funny little anecdote. I've tried to put out a book a year, but last year I found that I just didn't have the bandwidth to do it. And so I thought, oh, well, Wired to Grow came out 5 years ago, and I wrote my other 2 books and I got a better graphical look, and they got a little deeper. So I thought, well, I'll just go clean up Wired to Grow and I'll do a refresh. And typically a second edition, you change about 20% of the book. So I thought, okay, I'll update some studies, I'll fix it graphically. It won't be that hard. Well, when I started looking into the studies, so much had changed that I literally rewrote the entire book. Like, it's a brand new book. It's not really a second edition. So that's how much has changed, pretty much everything. Part of it has come from a brand new understanding of what memory is. And we now know that there's 9 types of memory. And that has evolved just in the recent period of time. And why things are changing is that, first of all, technology is giving scientists new tools for looking in the brain, seeing the brain engage in real life activities in live time, seeing the brain scans in real time, and even combining. There's 10 different ways to look at the brain, blood flow, electrical energy, sugar burn, there's all kinds of things that they can look at using MRIs and EEGs and all this stuff. And so, first of all, that science shifts, and we're getting smaller and smaller tools that now, instead of someone being in a lab, you can take these tools into an actual real environment, like a job or a community, and have people doing real things as opposed to kind of made up things in a very artificial, even uncomfortable environment. So the technology has changed, and then that has given scientists new ways to see things. So just in memory alone, there's just been a radical change in the understanding of what memories are, how they get made, how they get stored, how we lose them, how we regain them. So I would say, I was kind of stunned how much had changed. In addition, so memory is one of the big areas. Scientists have now actually also been able to see kind of that aha moment, or that moment of insight, and what generates creativity, what's going on in our brains before, during, and after it happens. And as a result, we're able to actually set people up for creativity or to have those aha moments. The theory of multiple intelligences, which was first coined by Howard Gardner at Harvard. And those of us who've been in education, it made sense. There's some people are smart with math, and some people are great with words. Other people are great with people. That's emotional intelligence. Well, it turns out there's folks who are very intelligent with spatial relationships and with the natural world. So there was this theory of multiple intelligences that people felt anecdotally they could see it. Well, now there's actually studies that show that there's a different neural signature for each of them. So they are, in fact, different types of intelligence. In addition, there's been studies that have really seen how much we can change and grow new neurons. There's some fascinating studies coming out about helping people that have been paralyzed for years actually starting to walk again, walk unaided. And it's just mind-blowing to see how they finally figured out how the brain and the body actually grows new nerves. And with the right kind of stimulation at the right time, the body can grow new nerves to the point where it can overcome paralysis. So all of these things were kind of earth-shattering. What started me on looking at memory was we had bought an Oculus headset as a holiday thing. And so I sat in my living room and was flipping through the various videos you can watch on there. And I was on this one where you're on an African safari and you turn around and there's a lion right behind you. And my body reacted as if I was truly in danger. Like I had the full flood of adrenaline. And then I was on a roller coaster and I felt the motion of that. And I realized, oh, my body's seeing this as a real experience, even though my brain knows, I cognitively know that I'm not there. I'm sitting on my couch. So one of the fascinating things I looked at in my book was the studies on VR. And it turns out our bodies actually code a virtual reality experience as a lived memory. And so that opens up all kinds of interesting things for those of us who are driving learning in organizations. You don't want to use it for everything, but boy, you should be thinking about having a VR strategy because it really is a powerful tool for certain kinds of learning.
Wow. So when I asked what's changed in the past few years, you weren't exaggerating when you said pretty much everything.
Pretty much everything.
And you just began to touch on how this might impact our understanding of learning, but obviously the two are very related. But is there any more detail you can give on how our improved understanding of the brain has improved our understanding of the way that we learn?
Absolutely. The biggest thing for me was understanding memory, because the scientists have now identified 9 different types of memory, and each one of them is processed in different parts of the brain. And ultimately, when we're creating learning, we want to create some kind of memory, because if someone has a learning experience and they don't remember it the next day, or they can't use it from 6 months from now, it's a wasted experience. So I started to get clear around, okay, which type of memory am I actually chasing here? Am I trying to create a habit? Am I giving people conceptual knowledge? Do I want them to have a lived experience? Do I want it to be, automatic, that somatic memory, kind of like Pavlov dogs, where you train someone, or an anchor gets created and then the behavior automatically happens without people thinking about it. All of those pieces of information really should inform a learning designer, because if you're doing it correctly and you're identifying the type of memory you want to create, then it really colors the choices that you make in designing and delivering that learning experience.
Amazing. And given how much has changed, do you feel like the learning industry is able to keep up?
Well, I'm hoping to help. That's the role I've kind of found myself in, is a little bit out on the front edge, and then looking to science and what we're learning, but then really translating that into the work that we do, because I'm in the room regularly facilitating people and online, creating online experiences. So it really is shifting what we do. And I think what's important when you're a learning professional is you have to keep learning yourself. First of all, you gotta do the thing you're asking of other people, right? Which is to improve your professional skills, be willing to learn, be willing to make mistakes, be willing to fail at something to get better at it, be willing to practice. So I think learning professionals need to embrace that for themselves. And when they do, then the learning industry evolves, right? But when people kind of stay static, then it doesn't evolve. The good news is technology is pushing every industry. Our world is evolving very quickly. Humans have not really evolved much, but the world is evolving quickly. And I think every industry is being pushed by change. In particular, the learning industry. I think people need to make a concerted effort to stay on the front edge of what the data is saying, so that they can pivot quickly and respond with better and better tools. I think we're only going to get better. I mean, the neuroscience is really helping us do a better job at our craft. But I think it's on us to stay current and stay fresh, and to not assume that what we knew 2 years ago is still the best way to do it.
Great. The next question, what would you say are some of the biggest misconceptions within the learning industry about the way that we learn?
Well, I would say this has always been a misconception, and it continues to be a challenge, is that just because you've created a learning event doesn't mean that you're setting people up to have the real behavior change. And yet what we're all really chasing is behavior change. I can't think of any learning we unroll in professional learning that isn't asking someone to do something different, act differently, speak differently, change their behavior in some way. And we're just not giving people enough time to practice. We're not showing them with demonstration how to do it well. And then we're not really grooving the habits. It takes 40 to 50 repetitions to really create a behavior change, to create a new habit. And what I see as missing in most learning experiences is we spend a lot of time talking about something. We don't spend very much time doing something. And so really a good chunk of time of any learning event should be set aside for practice, because you want to groove those new behaviors in the room. Otherwise, if you don't do that, the minute they go back to their environment, everything in their environment is set up for the old habit. And the reward is there, the cue is there, whatever routine they're already doing, it's already heavily weighted toward the whole old habit. So if you're not intentionally building the repetitions of the new habit, you're going to have a lot of great training and you're going to spend a lot of money on it. And 6 months down the road, you're not really going to see the ROI on it. You're not going to see the behavior change. So my call to all of my tribe is start building in practice. Practice, practice, practice. We are shortchanging practice. And so we got to give up some of the time that we have with people to focus on practice. So I do then the blended learning or the flipped classroom, where I give some of them the content ahead of time so that they can be practicing. We can spend the time in the room practicing.
So everything you were just saying, Britt, brings to mind a big part of your book, which is what you call the 3-phase model of learning. Would you be able to walk us through that a little bit?
Absolutely. And I want to talk about what it was originally in the first edition and what it is now. So the core of it has not changed. Here's the big aha moment, right? The three phases are learn, remember, do. Simple, kind of a duh moment, right? But when we're designing learning for other people, there's the learning experience where they take in the learning, whatever that is. And then that has to get into memory so that they can access it in the future. And then ultimately we're driving behavior change, the do part. So learn, remember, do. In my update with the new edition, those three elements didn't change, although I have a better understanding of how to leverage those pieces. So I've added a lot more data and tips and tricks inside of them for making the most out of your learn, remember, do. In addition, research has shown that before learn is this little thing called prime. So now there's a little thing on the beginning of the model called prime. This was really fascinating. Memory researchers found that if you basically, before you teach somebody anything, you quiz them on what they're going to learn. They're not going to get it right, but you basically ask test questions or quiz questions before they've been exposed to the content. And while they get all the information wrong, the very act of priming someone, it's like it creates a file folder or a schema in the head. And then when they learn it, that it's receptive, it's waiting there to be filled. And for some reason going, oh, that's that thing that I didn't know the answer to, now I know, creates an extra stickiness to that learning. So whenever we can prime people, particularly on the key concepts or the core behaviors, it makes that bit of learning sticky. It's like there's a placeholder, and as soon as the brain gets the answer, it knows where to slot it. So that was really fascinating. And now the whole model has a box around it labeled psychological safety, because what we've learned is that people have to feel a level of psychological safety in order to really take risks and be willing to make mistakes, which are core for all learning. Our bodies were designed to learn by doing, and that includes falling down a lot. I mean, think about how we learn to walk. It's built into our DNA that learning by doing and making mistakes is part of the process. So psychological safety is part of the learning culture you want to create, where people feel safe enough to say, "Ooh, I don't know," or "That was confusing," or "I'm going to try this, but I'm going to mess it up." And that then having a supportive environment for correction and feedback, and then doing it again, that's all really important. So that all now sits in psychological safety. And then two more elements at the top, I put a bar: technology to enhance, hasten, or scale. So technology plays an important role, but we should be very intentional about what role we're having it play. I think sometimes it's easy to kind of chase bells and whistles, and that doesn't necessarily make the learning better. So you want to use technology very judiciously and to enhance the learning experience, hasten it, or scale it, but not just to make it fancy. Sometimes a PDF is really all you need. So don't throw VR when a PDF answers the problem. But VR is a perfect example of, now that we know that VR experience codes as a lived memory, you want to really use that. Like when you're building skills, people to have lived memories of doing it right, for people to have the experience of navigating a space or an interaction, and they get to practice in that safe environment. That's a beautiful opportunity to really use technology to put your learning on turbocharge. And then underneath, there's another bar called, kind of having a culture of learning. That basically, the L&D department cannot create a culture of learning on its own. It has to come from the leaders. It has to come from across the organization. So if you have a fantastic learning department, but the CEO thinks learning is stupid or doesn't want to give people time to, pay for their time to learn, you can't really have a vibrant culture of learning. So the culture of learning is owned by everyone in the organization and is done through talking about it, valuing it, role modeling it, believing in it. The data is really clear that organizations that have learning cultures outperform their counterparts significantly. Faster to market, higher productivity, higher engagement of the employees, all kinds of goodies that change into big dollars. So there really shouldn't be a reason, but sometimes I still see some old school leaders who are like, oh, I don't want to pay for people to learn, or that's a waste of money. They should just be doing their jobs. I think they're fading, but some of them are still there, and it really has to be an effort. I think a lot of people in the organization can counterbalance one or two naysayers, but if the real whole culture of the organization doesn't believe in learning, it's really hard to create a great learning environment. With that said, millennials and Gen Z are really pushing organizations to respond. It's the top 3 factor they look for in picking a place to work, and it's the top 3 factor for leaving a place to work, is not having opportunities to learn and grow. So learning is another thing that humans hunger for, and I love to see these younger generations of workers being very vocal about looking for it, asking for it, and demanding it.
I think what we find so amazing about the 3-phase model is it encapsulates so much of what we kind of believe and where we think learning's going, and wraps it up so neatly. And I think what would be a really great question to ask is, perhaps if you could picture in your mind the perfect company, how do you think the 3-phase model would look in that organization? Sort of, what are they doing differently? What's their culture of learning like?
Well, first of all, it's talked about a lot. You know, the CEO is talking about what he or she is learning on a regular basis. They're investing dollars into the learning experiences of their organization. They are willing to learn themselves. The performance review process includes a place to comment on how much someone learned and grew and how much effort they put into changing themselves. And that counts for something. It's part of the score. It's rewarded. Certainly seeing people given opportunities to learn. So there's an investment in different kinds of learning, different modes of learning. Learning events are supported. Learning journeys are encouraged. So there's definitely an investment, but also a belief that people learn in different ways. So it's not one flavor is applied to everyone, but people are encouraged to kind of find and leverage their own best way of learning. And I think there's lots of ways we can do that. You know, how do you give people credit for reading a book? You know, if someone took time to dive into something, or they attended a conference, or they did an online, you know, webinar of their own choosing, not something hosted by the company, like, how do you give credit for that? I think it all should count. Certainly how you treat people when they make mistakes is part of it. So in a great culture, the leaders are saying things like, okay, let's break that down. What happened? What did we learn from it? As opposed to shame and blame. It's like, okay, well, let's not do that again, but let's dig in and figure out what we need to do so we do it differently next time. Certainly you have learning professionals who like their work and are learning themselves so that they can keep innovating and bringing fresh things to people. Those are just some highlights. And then, of course, you know, I'm never too worried about this. Every organization I go into, there's people who want to learn. The employees are hungry to learn. They're learning. The question is, are they learning through the things you're providing, or are they having to go outside the organization to find what they need? So really, it's an ecosystem. Particularly, I think leaders, managers, and senior leaders, when they talk about when they've made a mistake and what they've learned from it, you know, there's an open conversation around the learning process and how do we get better. I even love organizations that have failure parties where they celebrate some of their biggest failures and harness the learning from them. These are all elements of what make great organizations. And if you're doing some of those, great, celebrate that. And if you're not doing some of those, start figuring out how do you incorporate some of those strategies. There's a lot more ways to do it. In my book, I actually provide a lot of strategies that people can use to roll out in their organization. But more than anything, it's the spirit of it. It's the spirit of people hunger to learn and grow. Let's support that. Let's reward that. Let's encourage that. And let's make it really effective. That's the spirit of it.
Incredible. Would you be able to give us your top 3 tips for learning professionals, just as a final comment?
Well, if I'm going to be cheeky, I'm going to say go read all my books, because that's where you're going to find all this amazing information. So I do encourage, I think they're good. So go check them out. I also have learning solutions that you can get certified in my models and roll them out in your organization. I would say the second thing is really important. I like all learning professionals to think about themselves as habit designers, that you're ultimately instilling a way of thinking, speaking, behaving. That's what you're trying to do. So go from that. Go from, in an ideal world, what would these people be thinking, saying, and doing on a daily basis? That's what I'm trying to create. And then work backwards from there. because that's ultimately the shift you're trying to create. So if you get clear on that, then you can back up from that. What does the practice look like? What is the learning moment? Where are they starting? What tools am I going to bring to this to really maximize it? So really think of yourself as a habit designer. And with that said, kind of comes this attitude of being a consultant. When anyone calls me and says, Britt, we want you to do a training on X, I don't just say, yes, I'm ready, what date and time? I say, well, wait a minute. Let me first ask you some questions. Because inevitably, they've kind of in their mind gotten attached to the idea that they want a training on this topic. But when I start to dig in, I find out that there's really something else going on. And if I don't get to that and design for that, then I'm going to miss the mark. And we'll both say, oh, that was a great event, but we won't create the change we were looking for. So I think learning professionals should think of themselves as consultants and ask questions as if they're truly a consultant, maybe coming from the outside. Do a diagnostic. And I've shared some of my favorite consulting questions in some of my work before. And then the third one is really kind of this cutting edge, like everyone should be thinking about VR, XR, that continuum, and where are you going to put it in your strategy? It needs to be there. And now the devices are getting cheap enough that it's pretty easy to allow people to have a VR experience. But VR does a few things really well. It gives people the ability to navigate geospatial relationships. So you can use it as a way to onboard people to a location or to part of their job. It's really great for observational learning. If you have one of your experts film themselves doing something in a VR headset and then people watch it, the brain, when it looks down, even though it's not its body, it thinks its body is actually doing that behavior. So I've seen organizations where they're having plane manufacturers. They filmed one of the best, manufacturing people on the, in the hangar, putting the fuselage together, and you're watching your hands do it. Now, they're not your hands, but the brain actually doesn't really care. It just sees hands from a first-person point of view, and it codes it as an experience. In addition, you can have people practice the people skills in a VR environment. And we really need to do that because we're not always smooth at it. And when we can practice in that safe environment, safe for us to make mistakes, safe for the relationship because we're not really learning on somebody else, we're learning in this artificial environment, that's really helpful too. So, it's the places, the people, processes. You can show people, this is how you leverage your excellent performers, as you film them doing it so that people are getting an experience of watching someone do it well. So VR strategy for sure. You're not going to apply VR to everything, but start thinking about where and how you want to use it.
Amazing. If we can ask maybe one final cheeky follow-up unplanned for question. You mentioned VR a few times. Have you looked into other of the R's? What about, say, AR, for example?
Yeah, so anything on the scale can be helpful. VR, why it matters is when we're in the headset and the camera angle is filmed from a first person point of view, that's what matters. That's what codes the brain. So that's why, even though video is powerful, the fact that when you're looking at a screen, your brain, your eyes can see all this other stuff, we know we're not really there. We can gather information from it, but we know we're not there. Once you have the headset on, and the headsets can be used in different ways, right? But it's capturing that footage that tricks the brain into thinking that I'm actually standing there. That's what's powerful about it. So you can have that footage captured, and then you're doing some overlays. There's the XR, the AR, the VR. All of these things are worth looking into. But you want it for the brain to see it as a lived experience. It has to have that view, that 360 view.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Britt. It has been so enjoyable speaking to you and so interesting hearing all your thoughts and insights. Can't recommend people read your books enough as well. They're so interesting.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's lovely to connect with you and your listeners and your followers. You guys are doing great things too.